the first thing you notice is the silence. Not the silence of peace, but the heavy quiet of a world about to change. Cleveland, Ohio. Winter air biting at the skin, smoke rising in slow columns from tall brick chimneys. The streets are lined with mud and frozen ruts, horses snorting steam, iron wheels clattering over cobblestones. Somewhere down by the tracks, a train screams into the distance, carrying barrels of crude oil toward a future no one yet understands. In a cramped, lamplit office above a noisy street, a thin man with sharp eyes and a ledger in front of him dips his pen into ink. John D. Rockefeller is not a king, not a general, not a president. He is a bookkeeper in a world that still thinks in farms and factories, not in networks and trusts. But as he studies the numbers, the costs, the waste, the chaos of a young oil industry, something forms in his mind, a design. Outside, refineries flare like metal forests caught on fire. The air is thick with the acrid smell of crude and burning gas. Men cough, shout, gamble on fortunes as black as the oil they pump from the ground. Some will win, most will lose. Rockefeller is watching all of it. Railroads jockeying for freight, wildcat drillers going bust overnight, barrels leaking in the snow. He sees in the chaos not an opportunity for a quick strike, but the possibility of total control. One industry, one system, one invisible empire built not on land or titles, but on contracts, prices, and quiet, merciless efficiency. He bends closer to the ledger. A single figure is circled. If he can lower this cost, he thinks, if he can control this route, this refinery, this railroad, the entire map will start to tilt. Years later, the world will call it a monopoly. The Supreme Court will call it a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and order Standard Oil to be broken into pieces in 1911. But by then, the damage or the design will be done. The pieces of that shattered company will become Exxon, Chevron, and other giants of the modern oil age. The Rockefeller name will no longer belong to a single man at a desk in Cleveland. It will belong to a dynasty, an invisible architecture of banks, foundations, universities, political councils, and global institutions reaching from Wall Street to the halls of the United Nations. This is the story of the House of Rockefeller, how one family did not just make money, but helped design the operating system of modern global capitalism. Its flow of oil, its arteries of credit, its language of philanthropy, and its quiet, enduring influence over power. And it begins in that cramped office, with a man staring at a ledger, about to redraw the world. Soft call to action. If stories like this help you see the hidden architecture behind our modern world, you may wish to stay with us. Like, subscribe, and follow along as we continue to illuminate the shadows behind power. Oil and the ledger, the birth of an invisible empire. The first light of morning slips over the smokestacks of Cleveland, turning the haze above the city into a dull, copper glow. The streets are still half asleep, but industry never rests. Horses snort and stamp in the cold. Wagon wheels grind through frozen mud. Somewhere a whistle shrieks, sharp and metallic, as a factory calls its workers in. In the midst of this early chaos, a young man walks with measured steps. His coat is plain, his hat simple. He moves neither too fast nor too slow, as if he has already calculated the exact pace required to arrive on time without wasting effort. This is John Davison Rockefeller, not yet the richest man in America, not yet the symbol of monopoly and power. Right now, he is just a bookkeeper with a quiet gaze and a mind that refuses to stop totaling, comparing, weighing. He pushes open the door to his office and is greeted by familiar sounds. The crackle of the fire in the stove, the faint scratch of a clerk's pen, the creak of wooden floorboards under careful feet. Dust drift in the rays of light that slip through the window. On his desk waits a ledger, thick and heavy, its pages lined with neat columns and numbers, some written in bold, others crossed out with unforgiving strokes of ink. Rockefeller hangs his coat on a peg, sits down, and opens the book with a kind of reverence. These numbers are more than records to him. They are a language. They tell stories about profits and losses, yes, but also about habits, about waste, about discipline or the lack of it. Where others see chaos, he sees patterns. Where others shrug off a small expense, he feels it like a pebble in the shoe. It had not always been like this. Before Cleveland, there had been hardship, and the strange gravity of a family held together by a strict mother and a slippery, charming father. His father, William Rockefeller, was a traveling huckster, selling miracle cures and disappearing for long stretches, leaving John, his siblings, and their devout mother to manage as best they could. From her, John L. earned discipline, frugality, and a fear of waste. From his father, whether he liked it or not, he learned something about risk, persuasion, and the dangers of trusting appearances. As a boy, John counted pennies with almost religious focus. He tithed to his church even when he had little. He kept small ledgers before he ever saw a real one, tracking what he earned and what he spent. "I had a head for figures," he would later say, but it was more than that. Numbers were a way to control a world that felt unstable, a way to guard against the uncertainty that walked in and out of his house in the form of his father's footsteps. Now in this office, those habits are no longer the quirks of a serious child. They are tools. The young clerk runs his eyes down a column of costs: barrels, freight, insurance, losses from spills and fires. The burgeoning oil industry, centered in Pennsylvania's oil fields and exploding outward, is messy and wasteful. Wells rise and fall. Prices whip up and down. Refineries spring up overnight, then burn or go bankrupt. Most men see a rush, a gamble, a chance to get rich quick before the field dries up. Rockefeller sees something else. He has been visiting the refineries, watching the clumsy handling of barrels, the spills on the ground, the flames licking from poorly built stills. He hears the shouting of foremen, the laughter of workers, the curses of owners who don't quite understand why their profits vanish. In the harsh, oily air, he feels a strange calm. If this chaos can be tamed, if the waste can be cut, if the shipping can be controlled, if the business can be organized with the same discipline as his ledgers, then whoever does it will not just be rich. They will be irreplaceable. One afternoon, a partner leans over his desk, tapping a finger on a freight invoice. "We can't keep paying these rates," the man mutters. "The railroads have us by the throat." Rockefeller does not raise his voice. He never needs to. "Then we must stop letting them," he says quietly. "If we ship more volume, we can demand better rates. If we build better refineries, others will depend on us. We can use our steadiness against their disorder." There is nothing grand in his tone, no dramatic flourish. But behind the calm words is a radical idea, not to play within the rules of the young oil trade, but to rewrite them. Not to join the rush, but to build the road everyone else will be forced to use. Outside, a wagon rattles past the window carrying wooden barrels banded in iron, each one sloshing with crude oil pumped from wells miles away. The driver snaps his reins, and steam billows from the horse's nostrils. The air smells of tar and smoke. These barrels are going to be refined into kerosene, the fuel that is turning nights into day in homes and factories across America. Wherever darkness is being pushed back by lamplight, oil is there, invisible but essential. Rockefeller flips to a new page in the ledger and begins to write. Each stroke of the pen is steady, deliberate. He is not thinking only of today's shipment or this month's accounts. He is thinking of systems, of structure, of how to build something that will not depend on luck or bursts of speculation. An industry that will bend, slowly but surely, around his will. He has already begun investing in a refinery. He has already started forming partnerships. Soon he will take a leap and commit fully to oil, leaving behind the safety of ordinary bookkeeping for the dangers and possibilities of a volatile market. It will not look like a revolution. It will look like a man signing papers, adjusting prices, cutting costs, and negotiating freight rebates in quiet rooms. But sometimes, empires are not born with drums and banners. Sometimes they begin with a ledger, a pen, and a mind that refuses to accept chaos as fate. On the far horizon, in fields soaked with oil and mud, Wildcat drillers cheer as a new well gushes skyward, coating everything in black rain. They shout, they dance, they taste the oil on their lips without knowing who will refine it, who will ship it, who will profit when the rush is over. In Cleveland, John D. Rockefeller closes his ledger, satisfied for the moment. He straightens the papers on his desk, as if tidiness in this small room could be the first step toward order in the vast, unruly world outside. He does not yet know the full shape of what he is building, but the logic is in place. The first lines of the design are drawn. And once drawn, he will not let them go. The war years teach him something that no classroom or prayer meeting ever could. In chaos, those who can deliver reliably are kings. During the American Civil War, as soldiers march and cannons thunder in the distance, Rockefeller and his partners secure government contracts to supply food and materials. While others overcharge, cut corners, or fail to deliver on time, he insists on order, honesty in the books, and exact fulfillment. The profits are good, but what matters more is the lesson carved into his mind. Stability in a storm is priceless. If you can be the one steady hand while everyone else trembles, power will come to you almost of its own accord. When the war ends, the nation is scarred but hungry for growth. Railroads stretch their steel fingers farther west, cities swell. Demand for light surges, and kerosene, refined from crude oil, becomes the golden river running beneath it all. Rockefeller does not rush blindly into the field with a pickaxe or a drill bit. He chooses instead the choke point, refining. To him, oil in the ground is just potential. Oil in the barrel, fit for lamps, shipped cheaply and predictably, that is power made real. He builds his first refinery in Cleveland, far from the fields where the wells roar and gush. Some call this a mistake. Why not refine right near the source? But Rockefeller has already spotted what others miss. Cleveland is a rail hub and a lake port. Crude can arrive by rail or by barge, and refined kerosene can move out in every direction. The city itself becomes a hinge between the dark wells of Pennsylvania and the bright lamps of the world. Inside the refinery, he pushes for precision. Waste is treated like sin. Byproducts others throw away, like lubricants, paraffin wax, and even Vaseline, are refined, bottled, and sold. Every drop must earn. Workers speak in low tones about the man at the top, the one who rarely shouts but whose expectations settle over the plant like a constant pressure. He knows to the cent what a barrel should cost, one foreman mutters. You can't fool him. He'll spot the mistake before you even finish your excuse. The air is thick with the smell of boiling oil and hot metal, with the hiss of steam and the clank of machinery. But under it all, there is a hidden rhythm, Rockefeller's numbers, marching in strict formation. As the business grows, he attracts kindred spirits. One of them, Henry Flagler, arrives with a mix of ambition and financial wounds from earlier failures. He finds in Rockefeller not a gambler but a strategist. In dimly lit rooms above the city streets, the two men talk long into the night, their voices low, their words precise. They are not dreaming about being rich tomorrow. They are planning how to stay powerful for decades. They discuss railroads, freight rates, the value of size. The idea takes shape. If they can refine more oil than anyone else, they can ship in bulk. If they can ship in bulk, they can negotiate lower freight rates. And if they can secure lower freight rates, they can undercut every competitor until those competitors have only two options: sell out or be crushed. The first great weapon of their rising empire is not a factory or a well. It is an agreement, rebates from the railroads. To fill their trains, the rail companies are willing to secretly refund part of the freight charges to large shippers. Rockefeller and his partners, through intricate dealings, secure these rebates and even, in some cases, drawbacks on the shipments of rival refiners. It is as if, every time a competitor ships a barrel, a hidden coin drops into Standard Oil's pocket. The competitors do not see the coins falling, but they feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. In a small refinery on the outskirts of Cleveland, a man named Thomas sits in his cramped office, studying his own ledger. The numbers no longer make sense. Costs rise, profits shrink. He has done nothing different. He has not paid more for labor, not wasted more oil, not lost more barrels. Yet somehow he is losing ground. Outside, his workers move among the tanks and stills, unaware that on this paper, in these columns, their future is flickering like an untrimmed lamp. "How is Standard selling so low?" Thomas demands of a merchant one afternoon. "It can't be honest." The merchant shrugs, lips pressed tight. He has heard rumors, whispers of hidden deals, secret rates, but nothing he can prove. "All I know," he says, "is that customers buy where it's cheaper. If you can match their price, I'll buy from you. If you can't," the unfinished sentence hangs in the air like smoke. Back in Rockefeller's offices, the mood is completely different. The ledgers show a growing gap, a growing advantage. Standard Oil can afford to lower prices because its freight is cheaper, its refining more efficient, its waste reduced to almost nothing. Where other companies see the rebate simply as extra profit, Rockefeller sees it as a tool. He uses it to strangle competition gently, steadily, without shouting. Prices drop. Consumers are pleased. Competitors suffocate. Rockefeller does not gloat. He rarely speaks ill of rivals in public. When he approaches other refiners, it is not with open threats but with quiet offers. In private meetings, he lays out the numbers like a doctor showing an X-ray. "You see the future of this business," he tells them. "The small refineries cannot survive in such conditions. Join us, and you will receive Standa. RD stock. You will share in our security, our stability, refuse, and..." He does not need to finish. The charts, the freight rates, the falling prices all complete the sentence for him. Some accept, relieved to be swallowed by something larger before it is too late. They sign papers in rooms that smell of ink and pipe smoke, walking out a little dazed, as if they have traded their independence for an invisible insurance policy. Others refuse out of pride or stubbornness. They talk about freedom, the American way, and standing on their own 2 feet. They go back to their refineries, determined to fight it out. But the market is not sentimental. Month by month, the pressure mounts. Orders dry up. Bankers grow nervous. Workers sense trouble and begin to whisper. Night after night, the lamps in those small offices burn late as owners search for a way out. For many, the way out arrives wearing a calm expression and carrying an offer from Standard Oil, less generous now than before. In history, this period will be remembered as the Cleveland Massacre, when Rockefeller's Standard Oil rapidly absorbed or destroyed nearly all of the city's competing refineries. To those caught inside it, it does not feel like a massacre so much as a slow drowning. The smell of oil and smoke is the same as ever. The machinery clanks and hisses as always. But the numbers, the silent tide beneath the surface, are pulling them under. In Rockefeller's world, there is no chaos, only cause and effect. Volume brings rebates. Rebates lower costs. Lower costs crush competitors. Crushed competitors sell out. Acquired competitors increase volume. The loop tightens like a steel band around the industry's chest. In the quiet of his office, with the city's smokestacks glowing against a darkening sky, Rockefeller closes another deal and adds another refinery to the Standard Oil fold. Outside, snow begins to drift down, soft and indifferent. Men trudge home, their boots leaving temporary marks in the slush. In houses across Cleveland, lamps are lit with kerosene that increasingly flows through Standard's pipes, Standard's barrels, Standard's accounts. This is not yet the global empire it will become. The name Standard Oil is just beginning to extend its shadow. But in these early years, in these ledgers and contracts, the foundation is being laid stone by invisible stone. A new kind of power is emerging, one that does not need a throne or an army, only numbers, agreements, and the relentless logic of efficiency. Far away in Washington and other cities, politicians talk about tariffs, Reconstruction, and party politics. Almost none of them yet see what is being born in Cleveland. They do not hear the soft turning of this new machine. But soon they will. The name comes before the full shape of the empire. In 1870, as winter presses its gray thumb over Cleveland once again, Rockefeller and his closest partners sign the papers that will turn their growing cluster of refineries into a single, unified company, the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. The word Standard is no accident. It is a promise, and a warning, a promise that their kerosene will be pure, reliable, safe, a trusted light in homes around the world. A warning that they intend to become the measure by which all others are judged and found wanting. In a modest office warmed by a coal stove, the men gather around a table worn by ink and elbows. The air smells of paper, smoke, and sweat. Pens scratch slowly over the contract. Each signature is another step away from the fragile unpredictability of small partnerships and toward something more durable, more focused. Rockefeller signs without flourish, then leans back, his expression as calm as ever. Others in the room are more visibly excited. They see growth, opportunity, perhaps a kind of vindication. He sees structure. He sees the skeleton of a machine that can grow indefinitely. Outside, the city thrums. Rail yards clang and hiss. Barges knock against the icy edges of the Cuyahoga River. In nearby refineries, workers shovel coal, turn valves, and wipe sweat and oil from their foreheads with the same rough sleeves. None of them know that, on this day, a corporate form has been born that will one day overshadow their entire working lives. All they know is that the shifts are long, the pay steady, and the lamps of the city burn late into the night, fed by rivers of kerosene with a rising share of it bearing the Standard name. From the start, the new company behaves like more than the sum of its parts. It negotiates harder with railroads, presses further on efficiency, and spreads out with the quiet firmness of roots searching through soil. Rockefeller insists on vertical integration before the term exists in textbooks. Their own barrel factories, their own cooperages, their own warehouses, even their own tank cars. Anywhere a middleman stands, he sees an extra cost, an unnecessary risk. So he learns how to replace the middleman with Standard itself. In a barrel shop filled with the sharp scent of fresh-cut wood and the ring of hammers on iron hoops, a young worker asks his foreman why Standard Oil wants to own even this. The foreman shrugs. Mr. Rockefeller says if we need it, we should make it. He doesn't like depending on anyone else. Not for barrels, not for rails, not for nothing. The boy goes back to work, the explanation settling into his mind like another accepted fact of the world. The sun rises in the east, winter follows autumn, and Standard Oil finds a way to keep everything under its own roof. Yet for all the steel and steam, so much of the empire remains invisible, built in the quiet spaces between meetings, in letters carried by train, in conversations held behind closed doors. Rockefeller, devout and punctual, still teaches Sunday school, still gives to his church, still speaks in soft, measured tones. He genuinely believes he is bringing order where there was chaos, safety where there was danger. We are refining the industry, he might say to a visitor, hands folded, eyes steady. We are lowering the price of light. Is that not a service to the people? And in many homes, it feels like one. A farmer in Ohio fills his lamp with kerosene that doesn't smoke as much or explode as easily as the cheaper brands. A shopkeeper in Chicago can afford to stay open after dark, his shelves glowing under a single steady flame. The price per gallon edges downward and families notice. They do not know why it is cheaper or who is coordinating the factors behind the scenes. They just know their nights are brighter. But if the beneficiaries of this system are countless and faceless, so are its casualties. Hundreds of miles away, in the oil regions of Pennsylvania, the air is thick with the smell of crude, mud, and hope. Clusters of derricks jut out of the earth like wooden skeletons, crowded so close that one well's fire could leap to dozens. It is here that small refiners, independent men with modest plants and big ambitions, begin to feel the chill creeping up their spines. As Standard Oil tightens its control on freight rates and distribution, their markets shrink. Buyers begin to say, Standard can sell it cheaper. Bankers begin to hesitate. Contracts become harder to secure. In a cramped house lit by a flickering lamp, a refiner's wife listens as her husband paces, boots thudding on the rough floorboards. They're taking everything, he mutters. They go to the railroads, they go to the shippers, they choke us from every side. How do you fight a man who can cut his prices lower than your costs and still make money? At the table, a young daughter watches silently, absorbing the anger, the fear, the sense of being pressed by something vast and faceless. She will remember this, the way the word standard is spoken like both a curse and a sentence. Back in Cleveland, Rockefeller reads reports from the oil regions with the same cool focus he brings to a balance sheet. To him, the suffering of competitors is not cruelty, but consequence. He believes in consolidation, in the idea that too many weak players make an industry unstable, prone to panics and booms. The oil business, he will say, would be better if we had a few strong concerns instead of many weak ones. Order over disorder, system over scramble, the morality of efficiency. As Standard grows, it begins to extend beyond Ohio. New refineries in New York and elsewhere join the fold. Offices open in bustling eastern cities. Contracts are written in rooms overlooking harbors where ships carry American kerosene toward Europe, Asia, South America. A product once confined to a few states now slips across oceans, filling lamps in places where the name Rockefeller means nothing, but soon will. In these distant ports, dockworkers handle barrels stamped with Standard's marks, unaware that those marks represent a new sort of empire, not flagged, not sung about, but no less real. An empire of flows, oil, money, information. Its capital is not a single building but a network of offices. Its armies are clerks, lawyers, agents, and engineers. Its conquests are made not with guns but with contracts and price schedules. And yet, even as the system becomes more intricate, the center remains a man at a desk, studying numbers by lamplight. Rockefeller's health wavers at times. The strain of constant work, the pressure of endless decisions begins to show. He sometimes retreats to the countryside, to quiet places where he can walk in the fresh air and let his nerves unknot. But even there, the pattern continues to evolve in his mind. How to integrate pipelines, how to anticipate new competitors, how to stay ahead of both the market and the law. Because somewhere beyond the glow of his lamp, beyond the smoke of the refineries and the paperwork on his desk, another force is slowly stirring: public suspicion. The word trust has not yet become a curse in political speeches, and antitrust laws do not yet exist. But editors, small businessmen, and ordinary citizens are beginning to ask quiet questions. How big is too big? How powerful can one company become before it stops being just a business and starts becoming something else? In the oil fields in small towns, in newspaper offices lit by the very fuel Standard refines, the murmur grows. It is faint still, like distant thunder. But it is moving closer, toward the man who has built an empire out of ledgers and light. In a quiet parlor lined with dark wood and heavy curtains, John D. Rockefeller sits perfectly straight in a firm-backed chair. The gaslights hum softly. On the table beside him rests a neat stack of correspondence: letters from partners, reports from refineries, appeals from churches, requests for donations from charities. He picks one up, reads it quickly, sets it aside. His movements are economical, his face composed. A visitor, nervous but curious, watches him closely. "Mr. Rockefeller," he ventures, "do you ever feel troubled by how much of the trade you are taking? Men say you are driving them to the wall." Rockefeller folds his hands, his gaze steady and almost serene. "Young man," he replies, his voice measured, "the oil business was in confusion. Refineries were springing up without capital, without foresight, without care. We have brought order and stability. We have saved the public from ruinous prices and dangerous products. We have done only what is necessary to bring discipline to an undisciplined field." "But the others," the visitor insists gently, "those who lose everything." Rockefeller interrupts, but not with sharpness. "In every industry, the inefficient must yield to the efficient. That is not cruelty, that is progress." The words hang in the air, calm and unwavering. To the visitor, there is something both admirable and unsettling about this certainty. He leaves the house later that evening with the faint scent of cigar smoke in his clothes, and a deeper sense that he has glimpsed a new kind of power, one that justifies itself not with poetry or patriotism, but with accounts and arithmetic. Meanwhile, the machinery of Standard Oil keeps turning. Tank cars painted in the company's colors roll like iron caterpillars along the rails, bearing liquid light toward distant cities. In the cooperages, the ring of hammer on hoop continues without pause. In the refineries, flames roar beneath stills, and careful men in stained shirts watch gauges and valves, knowing that any mistake can mean fire, explosion, death. The company demands discipline but offers something in return: steady wages, regular hours, a sense that in a world of uncertainty, this job at least might last. Yet outside the walls of Standard's controlled environment, resentment is hardening. In a Pennsylvania town, a meeting is called in a drafty hall that smells of coal dust and sweat. Independent refiners, producers, and merchants gather under weak lamplight. Their faces are lined with worry, their voices edged with anger. At the front, a gray-bearded refiner slams his fist onto a wobbly table. "They call it Standard," he snarls, "but what they mean is only their rates, only their terms, only their prices. You think this ends with oil, today it's our trade, tomorrow who knows?" Murmurs ripple through the crowd. A younger man stands, eyes burning. "We can appeal to the railroads," he says. "We can go to the legislators. This is America, isn't it? We don't bow to one man's company." But someone else, shoulders slumped, shakes his head. "You don't understand. The railroads already favor him. He fills their trains. They can't afford to anger him. And the politicians," he trails off, the unspoken thought heavy. "Politicians need campaigns, campaigns need money, and men like Rockefeller have plenty of it." The meeting ends with more questions than answers. Outside, their breath turns to mist in the cold night air as they disperse into the darkness. A few remain together a moment longer, listening to the faint chug of a passing train. They know whose barrels ride that train. They feel, even if they cannot yet name it, that they are pushing against something far larger than themselves. Back in Cleveland, in a church filled with hymns and incense of coal smoke and bodies, Rockefeller bows his head in prayer. He gives generously to the congregation and to causes he believes in: education, missions, the poor. For him there is no contradiction. Wealth, he believes, is a trust from God to be used wisely and purposefully. He keeps careful track of his giving, just as he does of his profits. One ledger for the soul, one for the world, both maintained with the same meticulous hand. But the world outside his circle does not see the ledgers side by side. It sees only the spreading influence of Standard Oil. Newspapers begin to take notice. At first the stories are vague: mysterious consolidation in the oil trade, unusual power exercised over freight rates, a sharp-eyed editor in a city paper pens a column asking whether a single company should control so many refineries. The questions are tentative, almost polite. The word monopoly is whispered, not shouted. Rockefeller pays them little mind. The law, as it currently stands, does not clearly forbid what he is doing. There are no antitrust statutes, no robust regulatory bodies designed to police conglomerates of this scale. Business, in the late 19th century, is a battlefield with few rules, and he is simply proving more disciplined, more farsighted, more relentless than his opponents. Still, unease grows. A banker in New York reviews his exposure to various oil firms and realizes that, increasingly, all roads lead back to Standard. His loans, his clients' fortunes, the refineries they rely on, all are entangled in a web whose center lies in Rockefeller's realm. He leans back in his chair and taps his pen against the blotter, considering. Concentration of power can be efficient, but it is also dangerous. If one man, one company, stumbles, how many fall with them? He looks out the window at the city, the brick buildings, the smokestacks, the ships sliding along the water. In this emerging industrial age, the old symbols of power, land, titles, armies, are being complemented, even overshadowed by new ones: rail hubs, factories, trusts. Somewhere out there, he knows, is a man who understood this before most and acted on that understanding without hesitation. For Rockefeller, these are still years of ascent, building, acquiring, streamlining. The true storms lie ahead. For now, he refines his methods as ruthlessly as his kerosene. Secret arrangements, strategic acquisitions, the careful balancing act between appearing legitimate and being unstoppable. And yet, as the 1870s begin to flow toward the 1880s, a second force is beginning to form in the distance, just as real as the oil wells and the rail lines. Not a business rival this time, but a story. Somewhere, a young girl in the oil regions is listening to the laments of her father, who has been undercut and bought out. She watches the flame in their lamplight sputter and flare, and wonders why the name, Standard Oil, feels like a shadow slipping under their door. She will grow up to become a writer, a historian of this very struggle, a woman whose pen will one day help turn public opinion against the house Rockefeller is now building. But that is still ahead. For the moment, John D. Rockefeller closes another ledger, its columns balanced, its narrative complete. He cannot hear from his quiet office in Cleveland the faint scratch of another pen beginning to move miles away, a pen that will one day drag his empire into the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The oil has been gathered, the system is in motion. The invisible empire has been born. The Standard Oil System, monopolies, enemies, and the 1911 judgment. The invisible empire has been born. Now, the world begins to notice its weight. The year is sliding toward the 1880s. The United States is a country in motion. Railroads stitching east to west, smokestacks rising over cities, telegraph wires humming with messages that skip over miles in an instant. The old, slow world of villages and horse-drawn news is being replaced by something faster, harsher, more tightly wound. And in the middle of this new landscape stands Standard Oil, quiet, efficient, stretching unseen fingers through pipes and rails and contracts. In New York, the sound of hooves and carriage wheels echoes between tall stone buildings. On Broadway, shop windows glow behind clean glass, their lamps burning with a clear, steady flame, kerosene that has been refined, priced, and shipped under standard system. People pass beneath those lamps without thinking of where the light comes from. For them, this is simply progress. Nights are brighter, streets feel safer, workdays lengthen. The city pulses with a new electric energy. But in smaller towns, on muddy streets where independent refiners once did brisk business, that same light feels more like a judgment. On a raw, windy evening in Titusville, Pennsylvania, the cradle of the American oil rush, a group of men crowd into the back room of a local hotel. The floorboards creak beneath their boots. The room smells of tobacco, spilled beer, and damp wool. On the table lies a map of the region, marked with wells, refineries, rail lines. "Look at this," says one of them, jabbing a calloused finger at a cluster of refineries. 3 of these sold to Standard last year. 2 more are barely hanging on. They're undercutting us everywhere. Another, younger man shakes his head. "It can't last," he says. "People won't stand for it. The government won't stand for it. This is supposed to be a free country." A weary laugh circles the room. "Free," an older refiner mutters. "Free to be strangled, maybe." They talk about lawsuits, about appeals to railroad commissions, about organizing their own cooperative to negotiate better rates, but every plan runs into the same wall. Standard has scale. Standard has leverage. Standard has already wound itself around the railroads, the banks, the middlemen. Where these independents see single deals, Standard sees entire systems, and systems are harder to fight. Hundreds of miles away, in a quieter house, a woman listens to similar conversations through the thin walls of memory. Ida M. Tarbo grows up in the oil regions, the daughter of a man who once hoped to ride the wave of the oil boom. As a child, she hears her father and his friends talk about the South Improvement Company, a secret arrangement that briefly gave a small circle of refiners, including Rockefeller, massive advantages in freight rates and information. She remembers the anger, the sense of betrayal when the scheme was exposed and collapsed under public outrage. She also remembers what did not collapse, Rockefeller's ambition. Years later, sitting at a desk in a room stacked with papers, Ida dips her pen in ink and begins to write. She writes as a journalist now, trained, methodical, determined. Her target is the same company that cast such a long shadow over her childhood, Standard Oil. In her articles, serialized in McClure's magazine, the story takes a new form. What Rockefeller sees as efficiency, order, and discipline, she describes as secret deals, relentless pressure, and crushing tactics. She interviews former partners, ruined competitors, small-town businessmen. The voices pour in. Stories of midnight offers, sudden price wars, freight rates that mysteriously favor Standard, banks that quietly nudge borrowers to accept buyouts. On the page, those separate stories click together like pieces of a hidden machine. Readers across the nation, flipping open their magazines under the glow of kerosene lamps, suddenly see a pattern. The name Rockefeller, once distant and abstract, takes on weight, shape, intention. It becomes a symbol for something Americans are only just beginning to fear: private power so vast it rivals government itself. In drawing rooms and dinner parlors, people now talk about Standard Oil the way they once spoke about great land barons or railroad kings. But this feels different. Oil is not just land. It is movement, light, energy. To control it is to place a hand on the country's pulse. Politicians who once reached for Standard Oil's support with a practiced smile begin to edge away, or at least pretend to. As Ida Tarbell's investigation circulates, as other journalists join the chorus, the tone of public discussion changes. The word monopoly is no longer a faint whisper. It is a headline. It is a threat. In smoke-filled rooms of party headquarters, men in suits and stiff collars weigh their options. On one hand, big business funds campaigns, builds railroads, powers factories. On the other hand, angry voters topple politicians. "Something must be done," a senator mutters, flipping through a thick sheaf of clippings about Standard Oil. "We cannot allow one trust to rule an industry like this. It offends the American spirit." "Careful," another replies. "We built half of this new prosperity on men like Rockefeller. If we attack them too hard, we risk shaking the whole structure." Their voices fade into the hum of late-night traffic outside, the distant clacking of telegraph keys. Yet the feeling remains. A storm is forming somewhere between Wall Street and Washington. For Rockefeller, now older, wealthier, and more withdrawn from public view, the noise of this storm reaches him muffled, like thunder heard through thick walls. He no longer walks the refinery floors. He has managers for that, divisions and departments, a layered bureaucracy that once would have seemed unthinkable in the young, chaotic oil fields. He spends more time at his estates, on quiet walks, in meetings with a smaller circle of trusted advisors. His hair has thinned. His body sometimes betrays the strain of decades of constant vigilance. But his eyes remain sharp, his belief in his system unshaken. To trusted visitors, he still defends Standard's rise the same way he always has, with numbers. "Look at the price of kerosene," he says, tapping a table for emphasis. "See how it has fallen since we began our work. See how dependable the supply has become. Is that not a benefit to the people? Is that not progress?" It is hard to argue with a line drawn on a chart, sloping downward from high prices to lower ones. It is harder still to argue with millions of homes lit cheaply and safely. But beyond those lines, other costs are harder to draw. In the oil regions, the small refiners are mostly gone. Their names survive only as fading paint on the sides of old buildings or as bitter memories in the stories of those who lost everything. The Cleveland Massacre and similar waves of consolidation in other cities are part of the foundation of Standard's strength. To many Americans, that foundation now looks less like solid rock and more like a field of bones. And the government has finally decided it must take a closer look. In 1890, the United States passes the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law aimed at curbing the power of monopolies and trusts. On paper, It is a direct challenge to the likes of Standard Oil. In practice, it is only as strong as the will to enforce it. For a time, Standard carries on almost as before, adjusting its corporate structures, using legal forms, trusts, holding companies, subsidiaries, to stay one step ahead of scrutiny. Its influence threads through railroads, banks, and foreign markets. The empire is now more complex, more global, and harder to grasp with a single law or a simple rage. But Ida Tarbell's pen does not stop. Public pressure does not fade. And eventually, that pressure finds an instrument, the United States government itself, stepping into the role of challenger. In offices in Washington, D.C., where the air smells of ink and polished wood, federal lawyers begin assembling a case. They sift through contracts, testimonies, freight records. They read Tarbell's work and the affidavits of angry competitors. They sketch diagrams on chalkboards, trying to capture in lines and arrows the shape of something amorphous, a system deliberately built to dominate. At last, a phrase emerges in legal filings and newspaper stories alike. Standard Oil, they say, is in restraint of trade. The invisible empire is about to be dragged into a very visible arena, the courtroom. The courtroom is not a refinery floor. There is no smoke, no heat, no clang of iron or hiss of steam. Yet for Standard Oil, this quiet chamber of polished wood and echoing footsteps is more dangerous than any fire that ever licked the edges of a still. In 1906, the United States government formally files suit against the Standard Oil Company. The papers are crisp, the signatures clean, the language cool and deliberate, but beneath the ink lies a declaration of war. The Department of Justice accuses Standard of using unlawful methods to restrain trade, crush competitors, and monopolize the oil industry. What Rockefeller once built with contracts, rebates, and efficiency will now be dissected under oath, in the full glare of the public eye. Though Rockefeller himself has largely retired from day-to-day operations, the case hangs over him like a long shadow. He avoids appearing in court whenever he can. He is older now, bald, thin, his sharp features softened only by age. Ill health, nerves, and perhaps a desire to avoid spectacle keep him distant. But reporters follow him everywhere, scribbling in notebooks, describing his clothing, his posture, the way his carriage rocks over the gravel of his estate. The man who once preferred anonymity now finds the nation leaning in, hungry to see the face behind the trust. Inside the courtroom, the air is thick with anticipation. Lawyers shuffle papers. Journalists dip pens into inkwells, ready to capture the smallest flicker of drama. Spectators whisper behind gloved hands. A witness takes the stand, an independent refiner who once owned a small plant in the oil regions. His voice trembles at first, but grows steadier as he recounts what happened. "They came to me with an offer," he says. "Said if I sold to Standard, they'd give me stock. If I refused, they'd cut prices in my district until I bled. They said it softly. Not a threat exactly, just a description of the future." The judge leans forward slightly. A clerk scratches the words into the record. Another witness follows, a former railroad employee. He describes rebates and, more damning still, the drawbacks, payments the railroads made to Standard every time a competitor shipped oil. "It was like a tax," he says, "a tax paid to Standard Oil for letting anyone else do business at all." As the details accumulate, the courtroom becomes a kind of stage on which the carefully concealed workings of the trust are reenacted for the nation to see. Where Rockefeller once prized secrecy and quiet deals, the government now pries each mechanism into daylight. Telegraph messages, freight contracts, testimony from bankers, railroad men, and former Standard partners who turned against the empire. One reporter, struggling to capture the atmosphere, writes in his notebook, "It feels like listening to the anatomy of a giant being revealed bone by bone." Outside the courtroom, crowds gather to read the latest dispatches. Some are angry, furious, even believing that Standard Oil has violated the American promise of fair opportunity. Others admire the efficiency, the brilliance, the vision that allowed one company to tame a chaotic industry. They whisper about Rockefeller the way earlier generations whispered about generals, a man who saw the field clearer than anyone else. But admiration does not stop the tide. As the trial stretches on months into years, the tone of the nation hardens. Tarbell's articles have already cast Standard in the role of villain, and the quarter testimony reinforces the narrative in granular, irrefutable detail. The people who once marveled at the cheapness of kerosene now wonder what price was paid elsewhere to make it so. Lawyers for Standard fight back. They point to the lower prices, safer products, global reach. They argue that success is not a crime, that efficiency is not coercion, that organization is not restraint. They insist that Standard simply outperformed its rivals through superior management. But the government does not waver. Behind the scenes, Rockefeller's executives strategize. They reorganize Standard into a holding company. They shuffle ownership structures. They attempt to stay one step ahead of regulators. Every time a new rule takes shape, Standard bends, reforms, and flows around it, like oil poured into a new container. But this time, the container is closing. By 1910, public opinion has reached a breaking point. Newspapers declare that no private company should wield such dominance. Progressives argue that democracy itself is at stake. Business leaders watch nervously, some fearing the precedent, others quietly hoping Standard's fall will loosen its grip on the markets. Finally, on May 15, 1911, the decision arrives. The Supreme Court of the United States, in a ruling that stretches across dozens of pages, declares that Standard Oil has violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. Its structure, its practices, its relentless consolidation of refiners and pipelines, everything that once made it unassailable, is now deemed illegal. The remedy is clear. Standard Oil must be broken apart, dismantled, split into pieces like a great engine taken down to its bolts. Reporters rush to telegraph offices. Headlines scream. Crowds gather in the streets as if witnessing a public execution. In offices across New York and Cleveland, Standard's executives read the ruling in silence. Some stare pale at the pages. Others, surprisingly, smile. Because they understand something the public does not. Breaking Standard Oil into more than 30 separate companies might diminish its legal form, but it does not extinguish its wealth. Rockefeller himself, who owns a quarter of Standard's stock, becomes even richer. Shares in the new companies, future giants like Exxon, Chevron, and Mobil soar. The empire has been forced to change shape, but its DNA will survive inside every one of those successors. At his estate in Picantico Hills, Rockefeller receives the news with characteristic calm. When a reporter shouts a question about the breakup, he simply tips his hat and continues walking, his face unreadable. Perhaps he feels vindication. Standard Oil has proven so massive that it can only be dismantled by the highest authority in the land. Perhaps he feels wounded. The system he built with such precision has been pronounced unlawful. Perhaps, deep down, he feels relief. His health is fragile, his nerves frayed, and the weight of the empire has long pressed heavily on him. But what history remembers is this. Rockefeller did not rage. He did not protest. He accepted the ruling with the same disciplined composure that marked every step of his rise. The courtroom battle is over, but something else is beginning. With Standard Oil shattered by the government, the Rockefellers now face a question few had imagined during their meteoric ascent. When your empire is taken from you, what do you build next? The answer will not be pipelines or refineries. It will be institutions, foundations, and a new, softer architecture of influence that reaches far beyond oil. The era of kerosene kings is ending. A new kind of power is waiting in the wings. From oil to institutions, foundations, universities, and soft power. The clatter of typewriters and the hiss of steam have faded from his daily life. The man who once measured his days in barrels and freight rates now measures them in letters, visitors, and philanthropic appeals. John D. Rockefeller is an old man. At his estate, Pocantico Hills, the air is different from Cleveland's smoky winters. Here there are trees, rolling lawns, carefully tended gardens. Birds thread song through branches. Gravel crunches softly under carriage wheels. Yet even in this peaceful world, the habit of counting, organizing, measuring has not left him. It has simply found new territory. He is no longer the visible head of Standard Oil. The company has been broken, his direct managerial power scattered among new corporations. But his wealth remains immense, perhaps greater, now that the pieces of the old trust have bloomed into separate giants. The question presses on him, day after day, what to do with this fortune. In a quiet study lined with books, he bends over papers not unlike the ledgers of his youth. Only now the columns are labeled not barrels and freight, but education, health, research, missions. Reports arrive from experts, ministers, professors. They describe a world full of need, rural schools in decay, diseases ravaging poor communities, universities struggling to fund laboratories and libraries. Rockefeller listens. He reads. He makes notes in the margins with the same neat precision that once marked his refinery calculations. God gave me my money, he is reported to have said, not as a boast but as a statement of duty. To him, wealth is not simply private property, it is a trust to be managed. And if running an oil empire required discipline and system, then so does giving it away. He does not want to scatter coins from a carriage like a generous prince. He wants something more enduring, institutions. The idea begins modestly. Years earlier, he had supported a small college in the Midwest, an ambitious project that grew into the University of Chicago. In the early days, the campus is a scatter of new stone buildings rising from the Illinois plains, their towers and quads meant to rival the great universities of the East. Students hurry across windy courtyards, clutching books, unaware that their scholarships and classrooms are being quietly underwritten by a former oil magnate whose name appears only on a cornerstone or a plaque. In faculty meetings and administrative offices, the presence of that money is felt more clearly. It pays salaries, funds libraries, enables the hiring of scholars who will reshape entire fields. Some professors grumble privately about the source, trust money, monopoly money. Others argue that ideas, once born, owe no allegiance to the pockets that finance them. Meanwhile, Rockefeller's ambition in philanthropy grows more systematic. He consults pastors, economists, scientists. One of his key advisors, the Baptist minister Frederick T. Gates, urges him to abandon scattered donations in favor of large, carefully planned projects. In long conversations that stretch late into the night, Gates paints a vision of philanthropy as engineering. Identify a deep social problem, study it, then build an institution designed to root it out. Rockefeller's eyes, dim with age but still sharp with purpose, light up at this language. This is something he understands: diagnosis, structure, scale. Mr. Rockefeller, Gates says, you once refined oil, now you can refine charity. Out of these conversations, something new emerges: the idea of a modern foundation. In 1901, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research is established. Its laboratories, perched at the edge of New York, hum with a different kind of industry. White-coated researchers move through tiled halls, glassware gleams in lamplight, and the air smells not of oil but of antiseptic and chemicals. Here, disease becomes the enemy: meningitis, polio, yellow fever. The weapons are microscopes and experiments instead of contracts and rebates. A young researcher writes in his diary that our work is being funded by one man's fortune is inescapable. Yet in the lab, the money is abstract. What we feel instead is the weight of responsibility. If we fail, we waste not only his wealth but the hopes of those who suffer. Soon, more institutions follow. The General Education Board channels funds into schools across the American South, especially black schools starved of resources in the age of segregation. Inspectors travel by train and wagon, visiting one-room schoolhouses where children sit on rough benches, scratching letters into slates. They make notes on crumbling roofs, absent libraries, overworked teachers. Our task, one board agent writes in a report, is nothing less than the reorganization of rural education. The language is clinical, ambitious, almost arrogant. It echoes, in its own way, the old spirit of Standard Oil. Take a chaotic field, scattered, inefficient, wasteful, and bring it into orderly lines. And then there is the Rockefeller Foundation itself, chartered in the early 1910s, with a sweeping mandate to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. The words are broad enough to include almost anything. The challenge is to decide which anythings matter most. Rockefeller, increasingly frail, watches as younger men, trustees, presidents, program officers, begin to shape the new institution. He signs the documents, endows the funds, and then, gradually, steps back. Just as Standard Oil became larger than any single man, the foundation is designed to outlive its founder, to operate on rules and strategies that can adapt as the world changes. But if the form is new, the logic beneath it feels familiar. Find the bottleneck. Concentrate resources. Reshape the system. In the American South, that logic takes the form of a strange, quiet campaign against an enemy often unseen: hookworm. Health workers funded by Rockefeller money travel down dusty roads, into towns where bare feet pad over warm soil and parasitic worms silently drain people's strength. Clinics are set up in churches, courthouses, and schoolyards. Posters warn of the germ of laziness, blaming the worm for chronic fatigue and poverty. Medicines are dispensed. Latrines are built. Lectures are given in slow, patient voices. A sharecropper, watching his children line up for treatment, wonders who is behind all this. Some northern millionaire, the doctor says lightly. The name means little to the man. All he knows is that his oldest boy, once too tired to work a full day, begins to regain his energy. In the villages, the campaign feels like a blessing. In academic circles, it looks like a model. In political corners, it raises questions. Who decides which diseases matter most? Who chooses which schools are improved and which are left alone? When one family's fortune can tilt the scales of public health and education, where does private power end and public life begin? Inside the Rockefeller boards and committees, these questions are discussed in polished rooms where voices are measured and chairs are upholstered. Outside, they are debated in editorials, sermons, and union halls. To some, Rockefeller's philanthropy is simple redemption, a ruthless businessman using his gains to heal, teach, and uplift. To others, it is a transformation not of a man, but of a strategy. The same mind that once tamed the oil industry is now taming philanthropy, turning charity into an instrument of long-term influence. Oil refined into kerosene lit up the nights of America. Money refined into foundations is beginning to light up something else: the architecture of modern institutions. But this new light carries its own shadows. And the Rockefeller story is about to step beyond the borders of the United States, onto a stage where nations, wars, and global markets are all in play. The world is widening. And with it, the Rockefeller vision widens too. By the 1920s, the foundations John D. Rockefeller seeded have begun acting not merely as donors, but as architects, quietly shaping research priorities, guiding public health campaigns, and influencing the development of new academic disciplines. Yet something deeper is happening beneath the surface. The instruments of philanthropy are reaching beyond U.S. borders, into landscapes where disease, poverty, and colonial politics intersect with opportunity. The Rockefeller Foundation sends teams of scientists and administrators into Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Their mission, at least on paper, is humanitarian, but their entry into these regions is also a rehearsal for a new kind of global engagement, one that blends science, diplomacy, and organizational power. In the tropics, field workers trek through humid forests, the air thick with insects and the smell of wet earth. They test for yellow fever, map mosquito populations, train local technicians. They administer vaccines in remote villages where children gather shyly, watching the strangers in white coats. To many communities, the intervention feels miraculous. The pressure of fever loosens, outbreaks decline, and once struggling towns find new life. But in the shadows of those successes, complexities linger. Local leaders sometimes wonder why a U.S.-based foundation takes such interest in their health systems. Colonial administrators see the campaigns as helpful tools for stabilizing their rule, and diplomats notice that Rockefeller-funded public health networks often align with American commercial interests, smoothing the way for future trade routes, supply chains, and industrial ventures. Within the foundation itself, internal memos debate ethics and optics. "We must not be perceived," one program administrator writes, "as acting in the service of American capital. Our legitimacy is our greatest asset." Yet another memo, meant for limited circulation, notes that healthy labor forces and modernized infrastructures will significantly expand the potential for economic partnership. The duality is unmistakable. The Rockefeller apparatus brings relief and also design, healing and also structure. Meanwhile, in universities across the United States, Rockefeller money is reshaping intellectual life. Laboratories gleam with new equipment. Professors pursue research in emerging fields, economics, sociology, public administration, guided by grants that subtly encourage systematization, measurement, and managerial thinking. A young economist at Columbia reflects in a letter to a colleague. Is it accidental that the fields gaining Rockefeller support are those concerned with order, efficiency, and rational planning? Perhaps, but philanthropy rarely flows without intention. Indeed, the foundations are not content to simply support existing sciences. They help create new ones, such as molecular biology. They fund social research that influences government policy. They establish scholarships that send promising young scholars across the Atlantic to study global governance, development, and diplomacy. From the Rockefeller offices in New York, overlooking busy streets where taxis honk and crowds surge like tides, the trustees review maps, budgets, and reports that detail their growing international footprint. The conversations are no longer just about disease or education, they are about influence. What role should the foundation play in world affairs? One trustee asks during a meeting, the question floating above the polished mahogany table. Another replies, "We are uniquely positioned. We have resources, expertise, and the flexibility to act where governments cannot or will not." The room falls into thoughtful silence. The idea is not stated openly, but it is there. In a fragmented world, institutions could become the quiet connective tissue, and the Rockefeller Foundation, with its global network, could become one of those ligaments. But even as their philanthropic empire expands, the Rockefeller name begins to detach from its founder. John D. Rockefeller, once the titan of oil, is now a frail figure who spends mornings reading newspapers on a sunlit porch and afternoons resting in the quiet halls of his home. He donates millions more, ensuring that his foundations will have long-term endowments, but he no longer dictates their every move. Visitors describe him as gentle, humorous in old age, fond of small routines and predictable habits. He collects nickels to give to children. He reads scripture. He sits by windows watching the seasons shift across his estate. For a man who once bent an entire industry around his will, the calmness of these final years feels both surprising and fitting, like a storm settling into stillness. Yet the world outside does not grow still. On Wall Street, capital surges through markets that are becoming global for the first time. Banks, railroads, shipping lines, and oil companies, many descended from the pieces of the old Standard Trust, are expanding across continents. New technologies, radio, automobiles, electric power, begin reshaping everyday life. And nations, wounded by war and facing uncertain futures, grope toward new structures of international cooperation. The timing is uncanny. As Rockefeller's personal influence wanes, the world becomes ripe for the next stage of Rockefeller-driven transformation. Because another member of the family is rising. David Rockefeller, John's grandson, is still a young man in this era, studying economics, traveling abroad, absorbing the lessons of a world whose borders and markets are shifting. He peers into the foundations his grandfather built, admires their reach, studies their methods. But his gaze is drawn elsewhere as well, toward the beating heart of global finance. Soon, the center of Rockefeller influence will shift from oil to banks, from philanthropy to the architecture of globalization itself. For now, though, the transition is only beginning. The old patriarch watches from a sunlit porch, unaware that the groundwork he laid, through refineries, through foundations, through universities, has prepared his family not just to shape American industry, but to help orchestrate the emerging international order. A new kind of empire is forming, quieter than pipelines, smoother than railroads. Built not on barrels or freight rates, but on credit lines, diplomatic networks, and elite councils. And at its forefront will be a Rockefeller who carries not the weight of the past, but the ambitions of a new century. He stands in the quiet doorway of the Rockefeller Institute, leaning on a cane, watching young scientists hurry past. Their white coats flutter slightly as they move between labs, carrying charts, glassware, and questions too complex for the world he was born into. John D. Rockefeller, now in his 80s, is no longer a captain of industry. He is something else, an elder whose fortune has become a kind of shadow infrastructure behind American science, medicine, and education. And yet, as he watches the bright young minds at work, something stirs in him. A recognition that these institutions, these engines of knowledge, will outlive him, will continue shaping the world long after his voice has faded. One of the Institute's directors approaches him gently. "Mr. Rockefeller," he says, "we are preparing a new wing for virology research. The trustees would be honored if you would visit the plans." Rockefeller smiles faintly, adjusting his spectacles. "Young man," he replies, "I trust your judgment. My work here is nearly done." It is true, he feels it. His empire of oil broken apart. His empire of institutions thriving without him. The evolution is complete, from industrialist to philanthropist, from feared monopolist to widely respected benefactor. But power does not dissolve when its form changes. It migrates, it adapts, it settles into new vessels. And in this moment, the vessel is shifting again. As the 1920s give way to the 1930s, the world undergoes convulsions that reverberate through every hall of governance and finance. The Great Depression batters economies. Nations turn inward. Markets seize. Poverty grips millions. But in certain rarefied rooms, conference tables in Manhattan skyscrapers, policy circles in Washington, academic seminars funded by Rockefeller grants, discussions take place about how to prevent such catastrophes from repeating. The Rockefeller Foundation plays a role in these discussions that is both subtle and profound. They fund studies on monetary policy. They support economists exploring international exchange mechanisms. They collaborate with new global bodies, the League of Nations, public health commissions, international educational exchanges. In Geneva, under soft lamplight and the smell of old paper, a Rockefeller-funded research group debates the stability of global currencies. A young delegate from Europe writes in his journal, "The Americans do not speak loudly, but their institutions are everywhere." Their experts guide us, their funds support us, their data shapes our decisions. One feels their presence without needing to see their faces. This is soft power in its most refined form, not commands but frameworks, not decrees but institutions. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in rural China, a Rockefeller medical team trains local nurses in sanitation and epidemic control. The air is heavy with incense and coal smoke. Families gather along dusty roads to receive vaccinations. Some are grateful, others watch warily. A village elder approaches one of the field doctors, a woman from Boston who has spent 3 years in the region. "Why do your foundations come here?" he asks, his voice slow with suspicion. "You heal us. This is good, but healing is never free." The doctor hesitates. She has heard similar questions in letters sent to headquarters. "Because sickness anywhere becomes sickness everywhere," she explains carefully. "We are trying to build a healthier world." He nods, though she cannot tell if he is convinced. Back in New York, the foundation trustees read field reports, some praising the work, others warning of growing concern about foreign influence. The boardroom feels both insulated and exposed, walls thick, yet the world pressing in through every document on the table. One trustee clears his throat. "We must remember," he says, "that philanthropy is diplomacy. Every act of aid carries a message intended or not." Another responds, "But the alternative is retreat. Disease and ignorance do not respect borders, nor can we." The debate lingers late into the night, beneath the quiet buzz of electric lamps and the hum of traffic far below. Decisions made here will shape public health programs on multiple continents. The Rockefeller foundations are no longer simply solving problems. They are setting global agendas. In 1937, at age 97, John D. Rockefeller passes away. The news breaks across the country. Church bells toll softly in small towns. Newspapers print sprawling obituaries that recount a life of staggering contrasts. Industrial tyrant, philanthropic titan, builder of monopoly, architect of modern medicine. The contradictions are not resolved, they coexist, as they did in the man himself. But the story does not end with him. In truth, it is only beginning. Because the fortune he forged has now dissolved into an intricate web of foundations, trusts, universities, medical institutes, and policy networks. And each of these entities is alive, staffed, funded, expanding. They have their own inertia, their own ambitions, their own evolving identities. And something else is rising alongside them. A new Rockefeller presence, sharper, modern, global in outlook. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., the son, continues to expand philanthropy in new directions: national parks, historic preservation, international relief. He funds the land for what will one day become the United Nations headquarters. But it is the grandchildren who will soon take the mantle, especially one grandson whose name will become synonymous not with oil, but with global finance. David Rockefeller. Even as a child, he wandered through the halls of the family's Manhattan homes, listening to conversations about diplomacy, trade, education, and public health. As a young man, he travels across continents, absorbing languages, studying economics, learning how nations rise and fall. His education is not merely academic, it is dynastic. He walks through the corridors of the University of Chicago and hears professors debating social science theories funded by Rockefeller grants. He visits the Rockefeller Institute and watches scientists conduct experiments in labs his grandfather endowed. He meets diplomats and economists who speak casually of Rockefeller-supported initiatives. In Paris, he sits at a cafe near the Sorbonne, writing in a notebook as smoke curls from nearby cigarettes. "Our future," he writes, "will not be built in factories. It will be built in institutions, banks, councils, alliances. The world is too connected for isolation. finance will become the language of nations. He will be proven right, because the world is approaching another turning point, one that will make the age of oil seem almost simple by comparison. An age of global markets, multinational corporations, vast capital flows, and elite policy-making circles. And in that world, another Rockefeller will rise not as a refiner or a philanthropist, but as a banker, a strategist of globalization itself. Three ends where the next begins, on the threshold of a new century, where power no longer wears the soot of factories but the polished sheen of boardrooms and financial capitals. The torch is passing. The stage is changing. The world is waking into modernity, and the Rockefellers are already waiting in its heart. Bankers of globalization, Chase Manhattan, the Trilateral Commission, and the world stage. The city hums like a living engine. New York after the Second World War is a forest of steel and glass, a place where the air vibrates with horns, footsteps, and the low roar of traffic. On Wall Street and in Midtown towers, elevators glide up and down like pistons, carrying men in dark suits to offices where new maps of money and power are being drawn. High above the sidewalks, behind panes of spotless glass, a figure stands looking out over Manhattan. The Hudson River glints in the distance. Smoke rises in soft plumes from buildings. Ships move slowly in the harbor, carrying goods to and from a world that is rebuilding itself after the worst war in history. This is David Rockefeller. He is not his grandfather. There is no smell of oil on his hands, no soot from refineries on his clothes. His world is made of ledgers and telephones, cables and meetings, charts and flight schedules. He is a banker, a senior executive and soon the chief of Chase Manhattan Bank, one of the largest financial institutions on earth. Yet the family inheritance is not gone. It has simply changed language. Where John D. Rockefeller once thought in barrels and rebates, David thinks in loans, investments, and international reserves. Where his grandfather saw rail hubs and refineries as the leverage points of an age, David sees something else: cities, currencies, and cross-border capital flows. The New World economy, stitched together after the war by institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, needs bankers who can move money across borders as easily as trains once moved oil. He means to be one of them. He means in time to be the one. Inside the Chase Manhattan headquarters, the air is cooled by modern systems. The floors shine. The bank's logo appears on glass doors and polished metal. Telephones ring with the clipped voices of traders and branch managers. Secretaries move quietly, carrying files that detail loan portfolios not just in New York or Chicago, but in Mexico City, Sao Paulo, London, Tehran, Tokyo. Global banking, David tells a younger colleague in a low, calm voice, is not just about money. It is about relationships. Governments, companies, central banks, they must trust you. They must believe you will be there in crises as well as in times of profit. He does not speak loudly. He does not need to. His presence is understated, polite, almost shy in manner. But behind that soft voice lies a mind trained in economics and diplomacy, and a lifetime spent listening to how power talks when it thinks no one is listening. The world he steps into as a young banker is unstable. Europe is rebuilding. Former colonies are fighting for independence. The Cold War is beginning to freeze lines across continents. Capital wants to move, but fear and ideology press against it at every border. In this tension, David sees not a barrier but an opening. Chase Manhattan begins building an international network that will become one of the broadest of any U.S. bank. Branches and representative offices appear in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, on ground once controlled almost entirely by local banks or European institutions. Chase lends to governments, to major companies, to development projects that reshape the landscapes around them: dams, factories, roads, power plants. In Caracas, The air is thick with heat and exhaust as a motorcade carries David from the airport to meetings with political and business leaders. He listens more than he speaks, asking careful questions about inflation, export revenues, local unrest. He knows that a bank loan is never just a line in a ledger. It is a bet on a country's future, an entry into its political and social fabric. At night, from a hotel balcony, he looks out over the lights of the city. Somewhere in the distance, oil flares mark the presence of wells and refineries, descendants, in a way, of the world his grandfather once dominated. Now those wells feed global energy markets that depend on credit, pricing, and diplomacy as much as on drilling and refining. Finance sits above it all like a nervous heartbeat. In Sao Paulo, in Mexico City, in Johannesburg, the pattern repeats. Meetings in government offices with high ceilings and worn carpets, lunches with industrialists in restaurants full of clinking glasses, tour of factor. Whys where noise and dust fill the air. David's notebooks fill with observations, political risks, currency pressures, the temperaments of ministers and presidents. To local leaders, he is not just a banker. He is a bridge to New York, to the dollar, to a network of investors and institutions that can make or break development dreams. A loan from Chase can mean new jobs, new infrastructure, new prestige. But it can also mean new dependencies, repayments in hard currency, policy pressures, and a rising expectation that local economies will open themselves to global capital. In Washington, officials notice Chase's growing presence. In embassy cables and internal briefings, David Rockefeller's name appears again and again. He is not elected. He holds no cabinet post. Yet his movements, his visits to Moscow, Beijing, Latin America, Europe, often seem to align with broader U.S. interests, or at least with U.S. concerns. He is, in a sense, a kind of unofficial ambassador, one whose language is balance sheets and bond offerings rather than treaties. At the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, an elite policy forum that the Rockefeller family has long supported, David sits at long tables under soft lights as diplomats, scholars, and corporate leaders discuss global strategy. The conversations are careful, layered. They speak of stability, integration, development, interdependence. Beneath those words lies a shared belief that the world is moving toward a system in which borders will matter less than flows of capital, goods, people, and information. The oil empire of his grandfather bent a national industry into shape. The financial empire David is helping to build aims much higher. It seeks to shape the rules of an entire global game. But he is not working alone. Other banks are expanding. Other families and firms are reaching across borders. Governments, too, are asserting themselves. The system is not a puppet show. It is a crowded stage. Still, the Rockefeller imprint is clear. On Chase's global strategy, on the policy debates at the Council on Foreign Relations, and soon, on a new experiment in elite coordination that will reach across the Atlantic and the Pacific at once. It will be called the Trilateral Commission, and it will turn quiet conversations into an organized, ongoing council of the powerful. He stands before a window in the Chase Manhattan boardroom, hands gently clasped behind his back, the Manhattan skyline reflected in the glass like a second, ghostly city layered over the real one. David Rockefeller has become more than a banker. He is now a node through which information, capital, and influence continuously flow. Yet even this is not enough to meet the demands of the age. The world is shifting again. Europe is rising from the ashes of war. Japan is emerging as an industrial powerhouse. The United States, flush with post-war confidence, looks outward with a mixture of ambition and anxiety. The Cold War casts long shadows across continents. Nations that were once colonial subjects are now independent, navigating their first uncertain steps on the global stage. Economic crises ripple across borders faster than governments can respond. And in this tangled landscape, David sees a vacuum. The lack of a unified forum where leaders from North America, Western Europe, and Japan can speak frankly, privately, and systematically about the future. Conversations exist, yes. Diplomatic channels exist. International organizations exist. But none allow the intimacy or intellectual cross-pollination among business leaders, policymakers, and academics that David believes is necessary to steer the world toward stability and toward a version of globalization rooted in shared Western principles. So he begins to build something new. The idea takes shape in the early 1970s, at a moment when global confidence is cracking. Inflation rises. Oil shocks destabilize markets. The Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates collapses. In Washington and European capitals, leaders scramble to understand forces far beyond their individual control. David gathers a small circle of thinkers, Zbigniew Brzezinski among them, a sharp-minded political scientist, Polish-born, fiercely analytical. The two men share a belief that the world has grown too complex for nations to drift without coordinated thinking. They meet in quiet offices, over dinner tables, in side rooms at conferences. Papers are drafted, proposals revised. "What we need," Brzezinski says one evening, tapping the edge of a dossier, "is a body that is unofficial enough to allow candor, but structured enough to maintain continuity. A long-term dialogue among the world's most advanced democracies." David nods, the glow of a desk lamp reflecting in his glasses. "A commission," he murmurs, "not governmental, not corporate, something in between. A hybrid. A council of elites, not elected, not appointed by nations, but chosen for expertise, reputation, and influence. The intent, they insist, is cooperation, not control, dialogue, not directives. Its name will be simple, geographic, and David hopes unthreatening. The Trilateral Commission. The first meetings are held in the mid-1970s. Attendees arrive from airports carrying folders and briefcases, walking through hotel lobbies with the air of people used to moving at altitude. Former prime ministers, CEOs, senators, university presidents, diplomats, figures who normally stay within the boundaries of their nations. Institutions now gather around U-shaped tables under soft chandeliers. Coffee is poured, doors are closed, and the conversations begin. In these meetings, the air is thick with quiet authority. People speak in measured tones. They debate energy policy, global inflation, trade imbalances, technological change. They talk about the fragility of democracies, the rise of new powers, the tension between national sovereignty and global interdependence. A Japanese central banker leans forward saying, "We cannot address these shocks alone. Our economies are intertwined." A French industrialist nods. "We are discovering that energy, finance, and security now pull each other like tides." An American senator, flipping through briefing papers, adds, "Public opinion is not ready for how interconnected we already are." David Rockefeller listens. He rarely dominates the discussions, but his presence is unmistakable. He frames questions, nudges debates, ensures that participants from the three regions understand one another, not only economically, but geopolitically. Outside the meeting rooms, journalists speculate. Activists protest outside hotels, chanting that the commission is an elite club shaping world affairs without democratic oversight. Editorials accuse it of technocratic overreach. Some call it a shadow government. Others a Western attempt to maintain dominance in a world increasingly resistant to it. Inside, the participants dismiss such claims. "We do not dictate policy," one member insists during a panel. "We simply discuss realities." But the perception persists, because perception follows power. And the Trilateral Commission gathers people who hold extraordinary amounts of it. Meanwhile, Chase Manhattan Bank continues its march across the globe. Under David's leadership, the bank becomes deeply woven into emerging markets, sovereign debt structures, and international negotiations. Chase's skyscraper headquarters, its angular, minimalist design rising above the city, stands as a visual metaphor for Rockefeller ambition in the financial age. In the 1970s, David begins making controversial visits to places few American business leaders dare go. The Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China before normalization. Diplomats take notice. Presidents consult him. Ambassadors brief him before his trips and request reports afterward. Though he does not speak for the United States, foreign leaders treat him as though he does, because his bank's resources and his personal networks carry weight equal to national institutions. On a fog-draped morning in Moscow, Soviet officials lead him down hushed hallways lined with portraits of revolutionaries. Soft-spoken conversations unfold over tea and cigarettes. David asks about Soviet monetary systems, agricultural challenges, industrial modernization. He offers insights into Western markets, nothing classified, nothing improper, but meaningful. A Soviet economist later remarks, Rockefeller understands the choreography of global finance better than most governments. And perhaps he does. Again and again, David finds himself serving as a bridge, not officially, not formally, but practically, between worlds that do not yet know how to speak to one another. As the 1980s dawn, globalization accelerates. Computers shrink. Markets expand. Finance begins to move at speeds unimaginable in his grandfather's era. And David Rockefeller is at the center of it all, an organizer of networks, a convener of elites, a facilitator of cross-border investment and dialogue. But power carries burdens. Critics argue that the Rockefellers, through their foundations, their banks, their councils, and their commissions, have shaped global policy far beyond what any private family should. They warn of concentration, of technocracy, of influence without accountability. Supporters counter that the Rockefellers have consistently pushed for cooperation, development, and stability in a world prone to crisis. Both are partly right. Because the truth is this: David Rockefeller's influence does not rest in commands or decrees. It rests in architecture, in the scaffolding of relationships, institutions, and norms that shape how the world operates. Like his grandfather, he does not raise his voice. He does not seek the spotlight. He builds systems. And by the late 20th century, those systems form nothing less than a backbone of global economic order. But no system lasts forever. And the 21st century will bring new forces, technological revolutions, political upheavals, climate tensions, that neither John nor David Rockefeller could fully anticipate. The final will trace the legacy they left behind and the questions that remain. Legacy, fragmentation, and the question of power. The evening lights of Manhattan shimmer against the darkening sky, tracing the outlines of a city built on ambition, money, and memory. At Rockefeller Center, its Art Deco towers glowing gold against the night, tourists glide across the ice rink, unaware that this place was born from a family's determination to reshape the American city during the Great Depression. Music spills from hidden speakers. The bronze figure of Prometheus gleams under floodlights. The air carries the scent of roasted chestnuts from street vendors. It is a peaceful scene. But beneath the surface, the questions that surround the Rockefeller legacy run deep. The old titans are gone now. John D. Rockefeller, industrialist, monopolist, philanthropist, has been dead for decades. David Rockefeller, banker, globalist, chairman of Chase Manhattan, has also passed into history. Their portraits hang in museums and university halls. Their names are carved into granite, etched into plaques, whispered in lectures on business, history, and public policy. But the empire they built has not remained whole. It has fractured, multiplied, and evolved. Hundreds of descendants across multiple generations now hold pieces of the family fortune, trusts, foundations, private investments, land, art, corporate stock. No single Rockefeller commands the heights once held by John D. or David. Power has dispersed, diffused like light passing through glass. And yet, in another sense, the Rockefeller architecture has never been stronger. It exists in institutions. The Rockefeller Foundation, headquartered in a sleek building overlooking Manhattan's skyline, continues to fund global health efforts, agricultural research, climate resilience programs, and social innovation projects. Inside, staff members gather around conference tables with laptops open, reviewing proposals from Africa, Asia, Latin America. Their discussions revolve around disease surveillance, food systems, renewable energy grids, pandemic response strategies. The lineage of philanthropy has evolved from combating hookworm and funding universities to navigating the complexities of a world defined by climate risk, artificial intelligence, and global inequality. But the ethos remains: identify a system, diagnose its weaknesses, and attempt to reshape it. In a sunlit office, a program officer reviews a briefing on climate adaptation in coastal cities. He pauses, looking at the Rockefeller logo on the header. "We are working on problems the world will face for generations," he murmurs. "Some days it feels like pressure, other days it feels like purpose." Meanwhile, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a separate entity formed by younger members of the family, supports peacebuilding, democratic reform, and environmental causes. It was this fund that later helped seed the concept of sustainable development long before climate change became a daily headline. But these modern foundations face a different world than the one their founders knew. Public trust in elites has eroded. Philanthropy is questioned more aggressively. Critics ask whether billionaires and private institutions should influence public policy, or whether such power distorts democracy. A historian at a conference voices a sentiment that echoes around the academic world. When private wealth shapes public outcomes, we must ask who benefits and who was never invited to the table. A philanthropist responds, "But without these institutions, who would fund the long-term, risky work governments avoid and markets ignore?" The debate continues, unresolved. Beyond the foundations, Rockefeller influence lingers in the architecture of global governance. The land beneath the United Nations headquarters in New York, donated by John D. Rockefeller Jr., remains one of the most symbolic philanthropic gifts in history. Every day, delegates from nearly every nation walk through the glass entrance, past the shimmering murals and flags, unaware that the ground beneath their feet once belonged to a family estate. Inside the UN chambers, voices rise and fall in dozens of languages. Resolutions are debated. Peacekeeping missions are planned. Climate compacts are negotiated. The building itself, towering above the East River, stands like a physical reminder that private initiative and public diplomacy sometimes converge in ways that reshape world affairs. Likewise, the Council on Foreign Relations, long supported by Rockefeller philanthropy, continues to produce white papers, convene experts, and host dialogues that influence U.S. foreign policy. Its meetings remain off-camera, its conversations discreet, its impact often invisible but profound. In a quiet hallway lined with portraits of past chairs and presidents, a graduate fellow lingers before an image of David Rockefeller. The caption identifies him as a former chairman, a global banker, a philanthropist. What must it have been like, she wonders aloud, to move so effortlessly between worlds, government, business, diplomacy, and to believe you were helping to hold the international system together? Her mentor replies gently, "Every generation believes it is holding the world together. Every generation is partly right and partly blind." The student nods slowly, absorbing the lesson. But the Rockefeller legacy is not only about institutions and influence. It is also about land, space, memory. In national parks across the United States, Grand Teton, Acadia, Great Smoky Mountains, the Rockefeller name appears on visitor centers, plaques, and trails. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., devoted much of his life and fortune to conserving America's wilderness. Visitors hiking through pine forests or standing atop windy mountain overlooks often do not realize that these vistas were preserved in part through private negotiations, land purchases, and quiet philanthropy. A park ranger in Wyoming gestures toward a sweeping valley at dusk. Rockefeller, Jr., believed landscapes had a kind of moral value, she explains to a group of students. He used wealth from industry to protect beauty from industry. You can call it contradiction or redemption, maybe it's both. The students gaze across the valley. The sun dips behind the Tetons, turning snowcaps pink. Silence settles, soft and massive. Meanwhile, in Rockefeller Center, skaters trace looping paths under golden lights. Office workers cross the plaza on their way home. Tourists look up at the towering GE building, unaware of the long economic struggle that once surrounded its construction. During the Great Depression, when unemployment and despair gripped the nation, Rockefeller Center became a daring act of optimism, a massive urban development project built when almost no one was building anything. Its murals, fountains, and promenades reflected a belief in the future even at the darkest hour. And that belief, captured in stone and steel, becomes the final thread of the Rockefeller legacy. Optimism, or perhaps ambition disguised as optimism. A conviction that private action, well-funded, well-organized, strategically directed, can shape the world. A conviction shared by 3 generations, from oil to philanthropy to global finance. But with that conviction comes a question that lingers like a faint echo against marble walls. What is the cost of private influence in public life? For every argument in favor, efficiency, innovation, long-term thinking, there is a counterargument: concentration, imbalance, democratic distance. For every hospital wing funded, there is an accusation of whitewashing. For every diplomatic dialogue convened, a worry about transparency. For every act of generosity, a shadow cast by power. The final image is neither condemnation nor praise. It is a family standing at the intersection of capitalism, governance, and global design. A dynasty that helped build systems, economic, educational, and diplomatic, that continue to shape billions of lives. Some see them as benevolent architects. Others see them as hidden hands behind the curtain of modernity. Most see a complicated legacy, impossible to capture in a single narrative. And so we end with a scene that embodies this ambiguity. A young Rockefeller descendant walks through the halls of a modern foundation headquarters. Screens glow with data on climate models, global health initiatives, youth leadership programs. She pauses before a framed photograph of John D. Rockefeller, Sr. Thin, stern, intense even in old age. Beside it hangs a portrait of David Rockefeller, smiling gently, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She studies the 2 faces, separated by a century of transformation. Behind her, her colleagues are preparing a briefing for a new global initiative. Ahead of her, a conference room waits, glass walls, polished table, laptops open. She inhales, feeling the weight and possibility of her name. Then she steps forward. The door closes softly behind her. And the narrative of power, its uses, its limits, its questions, continues unfinished into a future still being written. Skyscrapers rise, markets collapse and rebuild, storms sweep across coasts, nations argue in halls of marble and glass, new industries emerge, digital, biological, planetary in scale. Old empires fade into memory, new ones form without banners, without borders. And somewhere in this shifting landscape, between a lab curing a new disease, a boardroom negotiating climate finance, a university shaping the minds of tomorrow, a bank advising nations on their futures. The echoes of the Rockefellers remain, not as a single voice, not as a single will, but as an architecture woven into the background of modern life. Influence changes its clothing. Power alters its vocabulary. Visibility. Tie becomes optional. We rarely see the origins of the systems we inhabit. We feel their effects, the electricity in our walls, the medicines in our veins, the global markets that rise and fall like tides. But the hands that shape those systems have long since passed into history, leaving behind only the designs they drafted. Questions linger in the quiet places. Who shapes the world we inherit? Who decides the direction of progress? And in a future built by many hands, can any legacy remain singular? Night settles over Manhattan. Lights blaze from towers. The city vibrates with 1,000 competing ambitions. In the plaza below, people walk beneath the golden murals of Rockefeller Center, unaware of the century of decisions that made their footsteps possible. A gust of winter air sweeps across the stone. The fountain murmurs. Above, the buildings stand tall, silent witnesses to a dynasty's long reach. And the story, like the city itself, continues forward, toward new generations, new uncertainties, new architectures of power still taking shape in the dark. The lens pulls back. The skyline recedes. The world turns again.